How we are live. राहुल कहाँ था तू you how फोन क्यों ऑफ था तेरा ऑब्वियसली क्या बुरा सारी चेयर इकट्ठी 70% नहीं ऑफ होगा फोन तो कैसे मिस कॉल आएगा ये सारी it's a sad story. Very sad.
कूल है हम नहीं बनाए वो दिख रहा हूँ मैं इधर नाइस यूट्यूब लाइव चल रहा है वो तीनों बंदी के साथ शेयर कर Okay, so hi guys. So we'll probably start the workshop now. Just raise your hand, those of you from first year. Okay. So I think let's just start with what you guys understand by intersectionality. Anybody
does anyone know what intersectionality actually means?
Anything you've heard about it? Anything you know? No one first year?
Second year?
Second year बताओ.
Second year को पता होना चाहिए.
No idea.
Third year के भी दोनों सब पूछ ले.
Like जो interplay होता है different kind of social like caste and sex and all
Right,
that
right.
you will interplay, and like maybe in women you consider low caste women and upper caste women.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yes, he's right. So, anyone else wants to? So, well, basically, the overlapping of identities, the intersectional identities, how that plays in social context and oppression and discrimination and everything else. So, like as he said, like within women also, you have like say like so-called lower caste women, upper caste women, the sort of different experiences they have, the different discrimination they have, and how do you deal with all those things in debate. So that's what this workshop will be about. Is that when like a lot of debates in general you hear about identities, right? Like it's about like the feminist movement, like you had a workshop with Christian feminism, or about race, about caste, about poor people, about oppression. But what's really important to understand in these debates is how the dynamics play out at a like more at a basically higher level, where you sort of look at the intersectionality of these identities, you see how it's different, and it is more intricate than just saying women and non-women, or say blacks and non-black people. We'll be talking about that in this workshop.
So basically, intersectionality in this slide is what he said earlier. So intersectionality is the interplay of different identities and different lived experiences that people might have had, right? So a simple example of that would be, for example, if there's a poor black woman, her experiences cannot be explained by, let's say, her being poor or her being black, right? You have to take into account that her belonging to both of those identities has affected her lived experiences and has created barriers for her that you need to take into account, and the privileges that happen for people who are not of that community are also to be taken into account, and that's what we'll spend the time discussing about. So basically, the first thing you need to understand that is that whenever you see an argument, or whenever you make your argument in a debate, you have to understand that the things that the arguments that you will make will never be binary, right? So, for example, if it is a motion on feminism, right, it will never be about, let's say, men versus women. It will never be about or in the case of, let's say, different communities, it will never be about poor versus rich, right? You have to also take into account that in cases of feminism, you have to take into account the privilege of certain sections of women as well in those cultures, right? So, which means that the stage for feminism is mostly taken up by privileged women who have the, let's say, necessary resources to invest their time in that movement, right? Which is something that other poor women might not have had. So, at that point, you need to also take into account कि उन experiences से कैसे your argument will be affected, and how you can counter other people's argument in this regard, right? So, so, so what? Let's take an example, right? Let's take a simple example. For example, if the motion is to let's say abolish reservation, right? So, what kind of arguments do you expect in such a motion, right? So, what is the first argument that you can think of on why you should abolish racism, reservation? So, any, yeah.
Reservation would be it would most likely affect the people who are the least privileged among the upper caste. Like it would be argued like reservation, like in a reservation, in the system of reservation, the people who have the most advantages from the reserved classes would be reaping most of the benefits, and the people who are at the bottom of their class would not be able to get as much benefit from it.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, that is the fundamental understanding of what intersectionality means, right? Ki the privileged people will most likely reap most of the benefits from the reservation, right? But you also have to take into account what are the kind of harm that happen, right? So, let's say you're okay. You want to speak?
The people who deserve to be there aren't able to accomplish that particular seat or goal just because the seats are reserved for other castes.
ठीक है, that's a fair point कि मतलब people it should be a merit based system. That is a separate argument in and of itself. मतलब if we are talking about intersectionality, we'll talk about let's say people, yeah, just a second. If you're talking about intersectionality, the point that privilege people from within that, let's say, from benefits, that is what we're trying to argue. That was a fair point कि meritocracy होनी चाहिए, and that is like a separate debate in and of itself. So in this case, ठीक है, you tell me that उनको ज़्यादा let's say privileged people from the low from these reserved communities will reap most of the benefits, right? But that in and of itself is not enough for you to take down the other side, because they can just go ahead and argue that ठीक है उनको मिल रहे benefits and that is something that we want because they still belong to that underprivileged communities. Maybe they are a bit more privileged than, let's say, their peers in that community, but they are still face barriers. They still have experiences in which they were, let's say, put down by society because of belonging to a certain caste or because of belonging to a certain religion, right? So in that regard, we still believe that these people should get that benefit. So how do you counter this point, right? You can do two things basically. Firstly, you can talk about how in any movement, let's say for example, it's the feminist movement, or let's say it's a movement that demands equal rights for all sections of society. Any movement will definitely have a limit to the exposure that it will one day have, right? It cannot solve all issues in society, right? It could, well, basically, how will these issues be solved? Is that first of all, you start some discourse in the society about these things through, let's say, social media. You form your own pages, you organize rallies, you make people aware of the problems that these people face, and then you try to bring discourse into the society on how it happens, and then eventually laws are made to protect people against this, or maybe there is some social change in which people's understanding of what suffrage for different people looks like, right? At that point, there is a change, and people from those underprivileged communities are actually benefiting from it, right? But that kind of the process through which, let's say, the initial process in which you, let's say, gain traction for your movement, or let's say in which you make people aware or you create discourse in the society about this, is always limited by, let's say, the amount of screen time you will be able to get. Maybe not necessarily this, but the amount of rallies you will be able to organize, right? So at that point in time, when this exposure that you get is limited, you have to protect, let's say, the most underprivileged of these people, right? Because, for example, if you're focusing on, let's say, if you're, let's say, focusing on probably equal pay in international sports for women, right? So at that point in time, okay, that's a fair point that women maybe should get equal pay because they're also playing the same sport, right? But the problem that then happens is that you're taking away valuable screen time because these let's say players in the international cricket are already very famous, right? These people are okay, they might have faced problems in their life when they were younger, but they're not facing these problems now, right? They might earn a bit less than their male counterparts, but that's still enough to sustain them. That they might have some problems, but what you're doing essentially is that you're taking away the stage from underprivileged communities. Let's say a woman in a rural background who wants to play cricket, but she doesn't even have a cricket bat, right? And when you take away the screen time, you're taking away the opportunity from these underprivileged communities to ever, not to ever, but to get this kind of representation, because that money or that exposure could have been better spent on these women, right? Secondly, what also happens is that whenever you make these gestures, right, people now believe that hey, we have solved. Basically, there have been a lot of injustices against these communities, right? But when these kinds of gestures happen, right, people now tend to believe that hey, we have let's say we did this for these communities, and now we have solved these problems to a certain extent, right? At that point in time, what happens is that it becomes even harder for, let's say, these underprivileged women to gain traction, to maybe just get a field, to maybe just get a bat, to maybe just get a ball, or maybe just get an opportunity to play, because they might have to spend all of their time at home not studying, or maybe, let's say, because their parents won't allow them to do so, right? At that point in time, these tokenistic gestures don't necessarily benefit these privileged communities, but they definitely do harm the people from these underprivileged communities. That's how you should try to argue, not just कि ठीक है उनका फायदा हो रहा है, because then the other side can just go ahead and say कि यार ठीक है उनका फायदा हो रहा है. That is something that that is something that we would want, right? Secondly, what also you need, secondly, on a principal level, you also need to understand that whenever these movements happen, right, as I've already told you that these are mostly organized by and propagated by very privileged individuals who can make videos on YouTube, who don't, let's say a woman living in a rural area who has to worry about her food every day, the food for her children every day. That woman cannot go ahead and let's say spend 3 hours in a rally every day, right? So these movements will necessarily be controlled by these privileged women, right? And as long as they're taking away the space, they're taking away the valuable screen time for themselves, for their own benefit, it's wrong on a principal level and a consequential level, because you're not actually ensuring equitable distribution of power, of resources in the society, which is something that their entire idea of which is something that the entire idea of the movement is essentially, right? So basically you are kind of, you can also argue, अगर इसमें थोड़ा सा ज़्यादा analysis लगेगा, but you can also argue that this goes against the fundamental principle of what the movement stands for, right? So which means that the feminist movement maybe stands for equitable distribution of power, of resources, of social change for all sections of women or LGBTQ people in the society, right? But when this happens, this divide between the poor and the rich women within that community rises, and there is essentially no way for the feminist movement to actually go ahead and now solve the problems of the underprivileged community, which is basically killing their entire idea of what the feminist movement actually stood for, right? And that is something you could have a problem with, because it takes away the legitimacy of the feminist movement, because if you are not upholding the principles that you want to, at that point in time the movement loses most of its legitimacy, because on a consequential level you can argue that people lose trust in that movement, and people no longer feel associated with that movement, because let's say a poor woman will never now feel associated with that movement because of the fact that her problems were never catered to when this movement happened, right? So at that point in time, people lose trust in the movement. So बैठ जाओ जल्दी यार थोड़ा. हाँ, so people lose trust in the movement.
If you guys want to place just another chair.
So this seats ले आओ यार थोड़ी.
First case can sit. First case can sit here. There's also another chair here and a chair here.
ठीक है, वो थोड़ा
taking away screen time वाला जैसे point है, तो like हम इसमें ये नहीं बोल सकते कि ऐसे तो like हर point of time पे हर section of society कोई ना कोई problem face करेगी, तो मतलब हम ऐसे अगर permanently emphasis देने की कोशिश करते रहेंगे, तो like जो लोग अभी suffer कर रहे हैं, maybe like जैसे मान लो कि actresses हैं, वो suffer कर रही हैं because of stuff like maybe casting couches or sexual harassment in the industry, but they're still powerful women, but we do not like take away importance from those issues just because they're powerful women, right? लाइक मतलब इस पे अगर हम फिर अपनी सारे सोशल बाकी सेक्शन ऑफ सोसाइटी पे फोकस करते रहे, तो मतलब हम ऐसे बाइनरी काइंड ऑफ
Yeah, but basically what you can, I mean, it's all about how you argue in debates, right? So there's no wrong and right as to these things. But in debates, if someone comes up and says, "This is how the feminist movement works" or something, you can, like what we're talking about, we can just break it up further, just go to a people level and talk about how does the feminist movement work, right? Like who drives it, who decides what the feminist movement will go for, what it demands to the government. It's the privileged people of amongst the women, right? Because they will sort of make their demands. They have the most social capital, the most financial capital to actually spread their message. And so what happens is the feminist movement generally caters to the more privileged needs of women. For example, let's say it's not wrong, but like let's say you want period leaves or something. That is the right thing which women can demand, which they should demand. But it sort of takes away, say, screen time, or there's like a limited amount of attention you have to get from society, right, or from the government. It takes us from say like more major issues, like say some women simply who can't go to school, or who can't get water, or who aren't allowed to work or something like that, or there's like forced marriages or something like that. So I mean, you can always argue these things and talk about how the feminist movement isn't the ideal way of going about things, something like that. So which is what we're talking about. I mean, we talk about motions, and we can have arguments from you guys as to what you guys think on the motion in general, arguments and arguments about intersectionality too. So
ठीक है, मतलब हाँ भी ये वाले पॉइंट पे मैं समझ गया क्या कह रहे हैं. We'll talk about that through some motions and some examples अभी करते हैं.
we can talk about
ठीक है.
I think we talked about this. I think yeah.
हाँ, ये तो बोल रखा है. मतलब इसमें एक और एग्जांपल you can see that in the case of after 9/11, many the fertility rate for let's say Arab women dropped by a lot, because these women were scared for let's say the discrimination that they will face and their children might have faced, right? So that is the kind of problem that is uniquely exists for these Arab women, that cannot exist for any women in general, that won't exist for any women in general, and that won't exist for any Arab man or stuff like that, right? So these are the kinds of problems. This is just an example. You might not use this in a debate, but it shows you that there are very unique barriers that these intersections that lie at the intersections of various communities. So talking about let's say
So basically, a lot of the times you can use intersectionality in debates to basically mitigate the impact of some argument people use, right? So you can probably, I mean, generally, if you want to tackle an argument, you probably try to, I don't know, counter their justification, the main point itself, the impact of something else. If you can't do anything, you can probably say that, like your argument just helps the privileged sections. Basically, like if you have a motion, I think one of the motions we sort of had in mind was
the motion was that this house believes that minorities should allow appropriation of their culture by majorities.
So I think we can first open this up to you guys. What do you guys think about this motion? I think
Do you understand the motion?
So like the House believes that minorities should allow appropriation of their culture or art by the whole population. So
By the
what do you guys
majority.
think? So do you guys understand what this means? So like appropriation generally means like there's this concept of cultural appropriation where basically people who are not part of that group sort of can't, I don't know, like dress up like those people or completely appropriate their music or their art or something like that. So this motion says that minorities themselves should sort of allow or promote that other people should also appropriate our culture, dress up like us, make music like us and stuff like that. So what do you guys think about this?
पहले एक बार appropriation थोड़ा आता है. Appropriation basically means that let's say you basically some cultures that have existed in these minority communities basically through the kind of their cultures through hundreds of years, right? And they uniquely relate to those experiences because उन्होंने maybe childhood से ये सब सीखा है, उनके scriptures में लिखा है, stuff like that, right? And the majority community is something that these people do not actually relate to those experiences. These people do not understand what happened that led to all this culture, right? And then people try. The argument here is that when these people make use of this culture, let's say for their dresses, for their decorations, they're kind of just minimizing the feelings or the thoughts that that went into those cultures, and that kind of reducing the value.
If you allow appropriation,
Yeah.
the authenticity or the actual emotion behind it.
Right. Okay. So anybody else? Yeah.
Maybe like if you allow appropriation, some of the authenticity maybe would be lost about those like cultural acts. But like it is a good way for minorities to actually keep their like culture alive in general society because it is generally difficult for them to keep their culture alive in where the majority is practicing some different kind of culture. So I think that would be a good tool for them to actually have their.
That's a good point.
I think if we allow cultural appropriation by the majority, then the majority might become more tolerant towards the minorities because they are actually trying and living the culture of the minorities. And due to this tolerance, there will be inclusion and therefore. Whenever cultural appropriation happens, it's not like it happened fully or it doesn't happen actually. If someone is trying to get himself into a new, let's say, religion, then he is, by some psychology, he is at least trying to read a book or two. Not if a religion has 50 books, he's not reading 50 books, but at least he's reading 10. So that 10 is also important for the culture to spread.
It's expanded like.
ठीक है. और किसी बोलना?
If cultural appropriation of minority cultures is allowed, then the authenticity of it will be lost and it will mostly be changed or so that it would be reflecting the majority sensibilities.
I think so. You guys have to say something before that. So a lot of people talk about authenticity will be lost. Can you guys build up on it? Like why would authenticity be lost? A lot of guys have mentioned that. Yeah.
Since the majority, they wouldn't really understand the origin behind the practices and they wouldn't really understand the emotion connected with them. They would like on the surface try to go along with that culture and then try to practice whatever they're proposing, but like they wouldn't really understand the deeper meaning behind why something came up.
I think you wanted to say
I wanted to say that instead of losing authenticity,
maybe we could add something to that culture. Instead of maybe the culture would lose their roots, but in a way we keeping that art form alive for further generations for longer. If it were to be it were to be.
You think cultures will evolve but directly survive?
It would evolve and
Directly survive.
longer.
Otherwise, they just die out because.
Yeah, it will just not be kept inside a certain community. Just
That's a good point.
Like at a point, if we completely stop that way, then people will still go and adapt it. Like, people will look at your minorities and they will be interested in it. They will adapt their own one. But if
You see, you're in control of how it's basically spread and
Yes.
onto other. Right. I think you want. Yeah, you.
So I think that in this is like culture appropriation, like if say an outsider wants to try to learn more about another culture, it would be likely through anthropological or sociological point of view rather than immersive concept in one culture.
Right.
So like they would try to understand it but instead of like for them it's like another culture, but for the people of that culture it's their generational or ancestral with or it's like part of their identity and an outsider would never be able to see that like that.
ठीक है. So इस डिस्कशन में तुम्हें कौन सी साइड से तुम आर्ग्यू करना चाह रहे हो, मतलब तुम्हें कौन सी साइड ज्यादा अच्छी लग रही है? मोस्टली लोग को प्रॉप किसको प्रॉप से आर्ग्यू करने में लगता है कि वो डिबेट जीत जाएंगे. दिस हाउस बिलीव्स दैट मतलब माइनॉरिटी शुड अलाउ, मतलब अप्रोप्रिएशन अलाउ होनी चाहिए. तो किसको लगता है प्रॉप साइड इज स्ट्रॉन्गर या फिर प्रॉप साइड इज बेटर, मोर हैवी? गवर्नमेंट साइड फॉर द मोशन बेसिकली. और बाकियों को लगता है कि ऑप साइड इज स्ट्रॉन्गर.
So people who think op is strong, why do you think op is strong?
किसको ऑप स्ट्रॉन्ग कर रहे हैं? हाथ खड़े कर दो.
There is some sanctity in a lot of rituals that every culture has, and when somebody goes on to somebody who does not understand the depth behind the depth of the meaning behind a ritual, behind the culture, they will obviously hurt that sanctity. It won't remain as pious as it's supposed to be.
ठीक है, तो मतलब
That's an argument, but like why guys?
मतलब बहुत सारे लोग
But I
मानेंगे
guess op
कि
is stronger. Like. Yeah.
There is a very real danger. Minority culture might be absorbed in the majority culture. Like there are smaller cultural communities. A lot of those traditions, in the process of appropriation, what happens is there are a lot of traditions that already exist in the majority culture, end up getting mixed with this culture, and at the end, what we get is more of a majoritarian kind of mix. And because of that, the actual uniqueness that was associated with the minority culture is lost. So there is no minority culture in
Right. So what do you want to say something? You want to say?
The main case, the main argument was that it will increase the acceptance for the minorities, but I think it will increase a pseudo culture. The majority will modify the culture or the traditions according to their thought process and everything, and it won't actually increase the acceptance for the true nature of the community or the true nature or the true emotion behind the culture and traditions.
Right.
So the whole argument isn't going as
I think there will be certain compromises on both sides. Majority community will show some acceptance for the minorities community, and the minority community may have to allow some of their unique traditions to be allowed to evolve or to grow. In the sense that, I understand that it is a tradition that's been going on for years, but it's not necessary to always continue with those traditions. Maybe we can grow on those, make better traditions that would allow everyone to intermix. Like acceptance levels will increase. That's the main point.
Right. So I think a lot of the points, before I come to, I think a lot of the points here basically talk about what culture is basically, how do you want it to evolve, how do you want it to propagate, do you want it to survive, where do you want it to survive, what does authenticity of culture mean, and where does that authenticity come from, and do you want it changing or not, right? But there's another sort of argument a lot of people bring in this motion for ops, saying that basically what happens when you allow appropriation is things that are unique to, like, say, the black community are when they're appropriated by like other races or the white people, all like basically they start earning money from those. Like for example, rap music, something which is like came up from the black community. It's wrong for people outside to say earn money from that culture, and it's better if you don't allow appropriation, so that people from the black community itself get benefited from the old culture financially, socially, and in all senses. Right? So that's one of the arguments from offside, that basically you allow the minority to own its own culture, and so all the benefits which come from it aren't say don't go to the white people because they're already very privileged, but the minority can have all the benefits. So how would you sort of oppose this argument from opposition? Yeah, go ahead.
So, if the originally smaller community, if it does better in particular culture, like if its performance in artwork is more acceptable to the people, it's also true that the majority class sometimes it has what can I say? It has a special not a special level of value for original art.
Yeah.
Like what is actually created by the minority.
Right.
Right. So in certain cases, it may become more difficult for someone from the majority community to produce proper art that is of a form of someone from the minority. And if he is able to propagate his art, if he is able to get the masses to accept his art, then he, I guess, deserves to take part in that. And so even if he, by birth, does not belong to that minority.
Like fair argument, yeah.
So, it could be argued that if you follow this thought that some part of the culture belong only to the minority communities and the majority communities or an outsider to the community cannot benefit from it, then it would be like assigning knowledge to specific communities. For example, like if a certain community has a magical formula for a life-saving drug, then it would not be right to say that only they have the right to produce it or only they have the right to benefit from it. So I think that the idea of assigning things to particular communities would be wrong, since a lot of knowledge is shared among communities and has always been shared.
मतलब
that is sort of, I mean, but that's sort of different argument, because what Opp is trying to say is in almost all spaces, for example, whites are privileged over black people. It's harder for black people to say become famous, earn money, and go to the top in that area because of all the barriers. So at least there's this one area which they own where they can rise to the top and where they have a benefit over other communities. Where it's better to be a black rapper than to be a white rapper because you do not allow white people to appropriate your music. So at least there's one area where they benefit. So that's what Opp is, at least. So they can at least gain this social capital, become famous through one area. So why are you stopping that? That's what the argument is. I think you wanted to say something.
So if a person from the majority takes part in the same service, say the rappers, if there is a white rapper, the acceptance or the market for rap in general will increase multifold. If one white rapper comes in and becomes famous, then a lot of white people will start listening to rap, and it just eventually benefits the black people because they still have a majority in that community.
You want to say something, right? You want to say something?
I wanted to say something, but it does not seem so important at that time. Because it's like about like how art evolves. So basically, like we have seen in history evolves when people like see each other's art forms and stuff, and like incorporate those things. Like maybe
Different
Van
ideas
Gogh,
from other
yeah,
cultures.
Van Gogh would like inculcate like the Japanese like stuff from the like vivid coloring in Japanese art forms into his own painting. So
Right.
I think if we would restrict like certain art forms to certain communities, it would like decrease the quality of art itself.
Right.
It comes out of society. But I don't know if that's like
That's I mean, you guys can have other points to it. That's fine.
The beginning is based on experiences, and it's not like some book appeared out of nowhere and people start following it. Some set of people from some set of areas decided that this act of practices would be healthy for us. But over the time, what happened was that every culture adopted something that was poisonous to themselves only. For example, if we take the Sati Pratha, it was poison, but it was still being followed, and until and unless people from a third person perspective, could not see that and tell that it is wrong in its entirety, the people will keep on following it. So every culture has some sort of point that needs to be removed, that can only be seen from a third person perspective, and that can only be accomplished when cultural appropriation is achieved. Happens.
ठीक है मतलब ये
I mean, all of these points don't make complete, but you could argue this in places and you can have like a debate on these things, and people sort of give counter argument as to maybe that's maybe not the case, or you can still sort of tackle this issue within the community. I mean, people still knew something was wrong within Hinduism too. Maybe there were other reasons why it couldn't be done or something. But I mean that's a fair point. You could argue this. How? I mean, I agree like with both of your points to some extent that having other cultures, their points of view, it can help evolve the culture in better ways.
My point was basically that if the black people only are the ones who are rapping, I think rapping as a form or as a profession will be associated with the black people. So what can happen to this is that if a black person does not know how to rap, like basically this is how stereotypes are propagated. And when some certain set of activities are associated with a certain group of people, then it leads to stereotypes related to that. So in this case, the minority might be stereotyped as people who basically rap, and this can actually lead to ideologies like these people may not be for let's say a high position job in multinational company, for example. So this can basically hurt them more than help them, because then they are losing on other opportunities at different jobs which they could have received.
Yeah, this is a good point. Basically, it propagates stereotypes and sort of puts people into boxes of identities, right? Yeah. So anybody else want to say something? Yeah, and one more thing you talk about, like when someone says, like this allows black people to benefit from their culture, what you can also talk about again, like we bring in intersectionality to mitigate the impact. Is that it's only the privileged among the blacks are going to benefit from rapping and all these things. It's only a very few people are very maybe 100 rappers in the US will benefit from this. So the majority of black people won't benefit from this anyways, even if it's not appropriated. But then all the negative points that they still aren't accepted into culture, there's stereotypes still propagate. Those negative points still stand for those other black people, and they get none of the benefits of say getting famous or getting money from that culture. So that's again. So intersectionality is often used in debates where basically sort of mitigate the other person's impact, saying it's not that, it's only for a few people, and the majority in that community still suffers. All those things still aren't taken into.
The basically यही है कि let's say whenever you see an argument from some side, from the opposition side in a debate, right? So you have to do three things, right? First of all is you have to make the point. Second, you have to show the impact, and third, you have to link the point with the impact that कि यही point से impact हो रहा है, not just something random उसका कोई cause नहीं है. So what you usually do is that you try to mitigate the point. You say कि यार नहीं ये point ही गलत है. You try to take away the link. You say कि यार नहीं इसकी वजह से ये नहीं हो रहा. That is something that happens because of some XYZ other reason, and that is something that we stand for. And thirdly, you can say कि impact नहीं है, मतलब कि इसका यार जितना तुमने impact दिखाने का try किया, it is not as much, right? So most of the times, many times what happens is that when you are debating against some good debaters, they won't make any fallacies in these three things, right? They'll make a good point, they'll give a very good link, they'll give a very good impact to you, right? At that point in time, it's very hard for you to mitigate by killing any of these three, right? So what you can further do is that you can try to think of, let's say, इसी example में oppression face किया, and that is why they should be able to use their culture for their own benefit financially, socially, and stuff like that, right? And the link is that इससे directly फायदा हो रहा है by cultural appropriation because they're saving their own culture. Otherwise, people from the majority will use their culture to gain money out of it, and maybe let's say overshadow all these black rappers, right? These if you don't want to have parallel debate, you have to counter this point. So what you can do is that you can basically say कि देखो फायदा होगा, this is something we agree. फायदा किसको होगा is what matters, right? Maybe you can say कि इसमें सबसे ज्यादा privileged लोग को फायदा होगा, जिसकी वजह से बाकी लोग को कोई फायदा नहीं हो रहा, and जो benefits हमारी साइड से हैं या फिर जो losses उनकी साइड से हैं, they still stand. So जो उनके benefits थे, you have actually mitigated the benefits by saying कि यार ये तो सिर्फ 100 लोग को ही हो रहे हैं या फिर ये हो रहे हैं. Secondly, what you can also do is that let's say if they're able to prove for in a community debate between let's say men versus women type debate हो रही है, ठीक है, if they're able to prove कि ठीक है इस action से women को बहुत ज्यादा फायदा हो रहा है, that is something that they're able to prove, they're able to make these three things very well, कि point, impact और ये सब सही से कर दिया. What you can also argue is that if that action, if that let's say motion negatively affects, let's say for example LGBTQ communities, right? Let's say this house will, for example, this house will increase. अभी assume कि reservation नहीं है parliament में. So, for example, this house will allow reservation for women in parliaments, right? So at that point in time, what you can do is ठीक है कि डिबेट ये चलेगी कि वुमेन को फायदा हो रहा है, मेन का लॉस हो रहा है, जो भी ऐसे इन जनरल आर्गुमेंट्स होंगे, बट यू कैन ऑल्सो टॉक अबाउट कि यार इससे क्या हो रहा है व्हेन दिस हैपेंस, इट बिकम्स, अभी क्या होता है, वुमेन एंड एलजीबीटी कम्युनिटीज कम टुगेदर टू फाइट अगेंस्ट अ कॉमन कॉज, इज दैट बोथ ऑफ, मतलब these communities have always been underprivileged and they have not gained got the kind of necessary resources that they should have otherwise gotten, right? So when you give just, let's say, and the majority of this is women, right? Matlab, LGBT community is still a minority even amongst this feminism movement, right? So when you, let's say, solve problems on a fundamental level for these women and you don't actually take into account LGBTQ communities, what happens is that it becomes even harder for these communities to now gain some sort of representation in the parliament. मतलब ये तो एक, मतलब मैंने ऑन द स्पॉट सोचा है, बट व्हाट, मतलब whenever you ऐसे कम्युनिटी डिबेट्स हो रही है, you can always think about कि LGBT communities को फायदा हो रहा है नहीं हो रहा. I've also lost many debates जिसमें ऐसे ही कुछ सिमिलर सा कुछ डिबेट थी, मोशन ऐसे ही कुछ था रिजर्वेशन से लेके एंड फॉर वुमेन एंड ऑल, राइट, एंड द डिबेट बेसिकली वेंट ऑन कि किसका फायदा होगा किसका नहीं, एंड then one person brought the argument कि नहीं, इससे LGBT community का बहुत ज़्यादा loss हो जाएगा, and that point it becomes very hard for you. You cannot easily argue in a debate कि यार 99% of the population का फायदा हो, लेकिन 1% को हमने sacrifice कर दिया उसके लिए. That is something that you can never argue. So even if you are able to prove a very huge benefit for these 99% of the people, if they are able to show कि वो जो 1% है जो पहले से underprivileged है या फिर पहले से resources नहीं है, they are even more marginalized because of this action, you automatically basically take this debate. So that is how you can also think, मतलब जैसे मेरे को एग्जांपल याद आ रहा है, thinking of different sections of society that can exist. हाँ बोल.
So basically, your point is that if certain part of the community is at a moderate level of, let's say, it's a moderate level financially or socially acceptable.
Gate up. कोई रहा gate up.
If a very small part of the community is at a very low social acceptance.
Exactly.
So to bring the moderate level to a higher moderate level or a higher level, we shouldn't
Yes.
push the
Smaller part further down. Yes, and you can even show कि let's say जो moderate वाले को, and the argumentation then goes like this, right? कि जो moderate वाले को फायदा होगा, which is कि let's say वो अभी पंखे में रह रहा है, he may be, मतलब directly मत बोलना, but जस्ट एग्जांपल है कि अभी वो पंखे में रह रहा है, मे बी कल को वो एसी में रह लेगा, ठीक है, उसकी लाइफ में मार्जिनल प्रेशर बढ़ गया, ठीक है, बट व्हाट हैपेंस इज कि अगर तुमने, जो बंदा रोज के 100 रुपए कमा रहा है, उससे तुमने 30 रुपए ले लिए फॉर एग्जांपल, देन उसकी रोज की लाइवलीहुड बिकम सो डिफिकल्ट दैट मे बी ही माइट स्टार्व द नेक्स्ट डे, एंड दैट इज अ फंडामेंटल प्रॉब्लम कि हम ऐसा नहीं चाहते, लेट्स से इवन इफ 1000 लोगों को एसी मिल रहा हो, वी डोंट वांट कि एक बंदा ऐसा हो जो फेमिन में मर जाए बिकॉज ऑफ XYZ reason. ये जो
and we talk about, for example, like if you look at the feminist movement, when they talk about, let's say, sexual harassment in the workplace and stuff, I mean, those things are very important. They should be brought forth. But you also can talk about debate how the movement should also focus on things like, you know, caste-based rapes or something, which are like completely different, and which the feminist movement doesn't really focus on much because it's the privileged people who run the movement. And so these are the sort of things you think, like for example, Yadav and Dalit rapes in UP and stuff. I mean, these things are very serious, which never come in the limelight as much as they should. And so these are something unique problems which can't be taken account just because they're women or just because they belong to a certain class, but also because of the intersectionality of the two. Leave those problems behind and just focus on the problems which the privileged section is facing. And so it's very important for social, or even like women in parliament. One thing is maybe like the LGBT community being ignored. The other argument to bring up is what happens a lot of times when there are like reserved seats for women in elections is the powerful politician, his wife or his mother or someone becomes the gets elected and becomes the mayor or whatever, and so the power is still amongst those privileged communities, or still with the sort of the guy who was powerful over there, and she's sort of just sort of like a puppet of the guy. And so the real women who need to be in this position of power really face discrimination, who actually face the problems women are facing, never get into those positions of power. And the government can just put their hands up and say, we have done whatever we could for women, and now look, there's 50-50 representation in parliament, everything has been solved. Which is not the case. Not everything has been solved with those things. And so this is sort of arguments you bring up in debates by saying, you know, when you come with these policies, maybe it does benefit because like the discriminatory policies of the government stay the same, but the government can now say that we have solved all the issues. And so this is how you can sort of counter the arguments why like reserving seats for women is so strong, and those like there can be better policies which target at the actual problems on the ground, which can make these things better. Even for women's cricket, for example, what I talked about before, I mean, equal pay for both teams just sort of send out the message that we've solved everything in sports, like women and men's sports at the same level. It's not the truth, right? I mean, at the ground level, like at grassroots level, there's still a lot of discrimination, there's still a lot of problems. The facilities for women's sport aren't anywhere close to like men's sport. Even I don't have, for example, women's cricket or football team. So, I mean, you can talk about all these things where it's more important to focus on those things. It's more important to change the attitudes, give facilities to women's sport rather than just showing key teams who anyways earn lakhs of money are now earning the same. I mean, so these are sort of arguments which you can basically bring up.
एंड इसमें बस ये याद रखना कि जैसे अभी हमने बोला इसमें सिर्फ ये बोलने से नहीं, हमने पहले बता रखा है कि यू डोंट जस्ट हैव टू से कि यार उनका फायदा है, बिकॉज़ देन द अदर साइड विल जस्ट से कि ठीक है उनका तो फायदा हो रहा है, एटलीस्ट उनका तो फायदा हो रहा है, कुछ तो डेल्टा पॉजिटिव हम कर रहे हैं. यू हैव टू शो कि उससे उनके फायदे होने से मूवमेंट का नुकसान हो रहा है, मॉरली मूवमेंट का नुकसान हो रहा है, लेट्स से कि स्क्रीन टाइम लिमिटेड है वो नुकसान हो रहा है, दूसरा कि टोकनिस्टिक जेस्चर हो गया जिसकी वजह से लोगों को लगता है कि चलो ठीक है बहुत सारी प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व हो गई है, सोसाइटी में आगे बढ़ रहे हैं, बट ऑन द ग्राउंड लेवल द प्रॉब्लम इज स्टिल एग्जिस्ट एंड उनके लिए अब इट्स इवन हार्डर फॉर देम टू एवर लेट्स से गेन दिस काइंड्स ऑफ बेनिफिट्स फ्रॉम this movement, right? And thirdly, you can also talk about how it is wrong on a moral level कि जो privileged लोग हैं they are getting more privileged once again, and their moral obligation should have been towards, let's say, the least privileged of the section of the society, and they are not following that when the moral obligation was for the movement was the same, right? So बस ये मत करना कि ठीक है इनका कम फायदा हो रहा है, ये भी कर सकते हो, इससे थोड़ा सा मिटिगेट हो जाएगा, but you can also let's say bring on how कि उनके फायदे होने से in general उनके फायदे होने में जितना एफर्ट लगा है उससे that effort could have been better used somewhere else, और उस effort या फिर उस effort की वजह से अब उन लोगों के लिए उतना effort करना जो underprivileged लोग हैं that is even hard, ऐसा कुछ
और how those people feel disengaged from the movement. I mean,
exactly.
as a poor woman living in some village, if you see, they're asking for, I don't know, period leave or something, you're not going to feel very engaged with the movement. If they never talk about you, if there's no one like you who's leading that movement, you're never going to feel part of it. And so the feminist movement will never get traction amongst these communities. And that's something we can talk about. And so these things will never change. So something like that.
If we try to mitigate maybe policy or something like this about like say workplace harassment or period leave, like is this like something like what exactly is are you in your paradigm that is?
I mean, I mean, of course, it's right for them to ask period leave, so right to oppose workplace harassment. But you can say that, I mean, it's about like the feminist movement should also be more inclusive towards the other problems and not just focus on this happening. That's how you can sort of mitigate what they're doing right now.
मतलब इससे तो कोई नहीं लगना चाहिए कि the motion will never be that this house says that the feminist movement should oppose workplace harassment. मतलब ये motion नहीं होगा ना.
That's like so the house believes that the left should not glorify individual politicians who belong to marginalized groups on the basis of them belonging to a group. So I'll repeat again. So the house believes the left should not glorify individual politicians who belong to marginalized groups on the basis of their belonging to that group. So this is the motion.
So for example,
what do you guys think about it? Do you guys understand the motion?
Was it glorify?
Glorify.
Like what's another example? Yeah. For example, let's say कोई Dalit person becomes a let's say leader of a very big community या फिर politics में बहुत let's say seat in Rajya Sabha, then you glorify him by saying कि देखो एक दलित बंदा इतने हाई पोजीशन पे पहुंचे, that's kind of the gist of it. For an example, तो ये चीजें नहीं करनी चाहिए लेफ्ट को, which is to say कि maybe उसको glorify कर सकते हो तुम, but not as a dalit person, but as a person जिसने इतने efforts किए हैं, उसकी identity should not matter in that glorification. ये basically बोल.
He should be glorified just because he's part of that group, basically. So, see, I think someone was asking what left means. I think you were asking. Yeah. So left is generally, I mean, it's sort of hard to define what the left is, but generally it's sort of parties or the sort of the side in politics which sort of, I guess, fights against conservative ideas like capitalism or fights for minority rights. It's not always true, but more or less so. People will generally say like both parties might have some other policies, and it's very hard to define what the left means. But when people say left, generally they mean these sort of parties.
So the parties conventional ideas को oppose करते हैं.
Not conventional ideas. There's like for socialist ideas, for things like reservation, for minorities, against. So you see, like what's generally Congress and communist parties for? What are they against? Democrats for the US. Those sort of things. Yeah. So that's what the motion. What do you guys think about the motion in general, and then how do you guys think intersectionality can come into play in this motion? So, yeah.
You know the like multiple leaders who are like they belong to a certain community. They are defined based on just their just being part of it. They are already on a privilege they are already in the privilege section. So glorifying further does not in any way help the underprivileged people in that community. In fact, it may result in him it may result in some people believing that this community has a privilege, a glorified political leader, and maybe that solves their problems.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Obama is a great example of this, right? So, like, when Obama became president, people said, "Oh, we have a black president now." But if you look at Obama's background in the world, and see it an extremely sort of well-educated, privileged background when he grew up. Versus most black people don't even afford to go into university in the first place, forget Harvard. And they want to communities where there's a lot of violence, right? There's a lot of problems. They live in poor communities. Education is horrible over there. And so, like when Obama was glorified just because he was black and not because of the experiences he faced, it's sort of injustice towards the black community because they do not really have the representation they need in positions of power. Right? Because no one who's faced what they face is really there. It's just the person just because he has the same color, the person is being glorified, right? So Obama is a great example of this, and so you can talk about in debates where the other side says, it's great for the community. They need to have representation. They need to have people understand what they face. You can see that whenever these things are going to happen. Enough education, enough financial capital, they're going to be glorified first. They don't really understand what this community faces, right? And so that is the problems which we can sort of face. So yes,
maybe we could say that like maybe Obama reaching the level of the president, that would be probably symmetric on both sides because people with more capital and more social capital and financial capital would always be more likely to succeed in any kind of world. But once we maybe like link the identity of that person with the position that they have acquired, like maybe saying that they're a black president, we are creating a society wherein there are more people who are positioned in power from that community, which was earlier not in a position of power. People, maybe children from that community now feel maybe like more comfortable going into those sectors now. Like they feel a lesser level of friction since they can have maybe role models or something like who they identify with. Because we see that maybe like say taking a different scenario, maybe like saying men in STEM. Say men in general when they like boys when they read